Hello everyone, and welcome to another cartography lecture video. And in this lecture video, I want to lay the groundwork for our discussion on scale and generalization. So in this module, we're going to discuss the concept of scale from two different perspectives. The first perspective on scale is going to be this idea of cartographic scale. Also known sometimes as map scale, which is really just the relationship between the size and distance of objects on the map and size and distance of objects in the real world. So this is all about the size relationship between objects on a map and objects in the real world. All right, and we're going to come back to this particular definition of scale a lot in this class. I mean, obviously it's cartography, cartographic scale, that makes sense. But this idea of scale plays a very critical role when we're designing layouts by helping us determine the sort of level of detail that we would expect or need for a given data set, which is going to play into this concept of generalization in just a minute. The other type of scale that we're going to talk about is this idea of geographic scale. Right, and geographic scale sort of comes at this idea from a completely different perspective, whereas cartographic scale is usually more of a mathematical relationship. Geographic scale is more of a conceptual description, and it would be something like we're working at the county scale, which would mean that we are dealing with data at the county level, or state scale, or global scale. Right? These are different sort of geographic size units. Right? These are geographic size units that describe the area and extent of the data, or the size of what we'll call mapping units. I'll put mapping units in quotes. And we'll come back to this idea of mapping units in a later video. But hopefully you can see just from this brief description that these two different approaches to scale have two different implications, two different sort of perspectives, but they both are important. One is more of a mathematical relationship, and the other is this conceptual description. So once we have a solid understanding of this idea of scale from both perspectives, and we kind of understand the role that they play when making a map, we can then move on to this idea of generalization. So generalization, sort of at its broadest level, is this idea that we can manipulate or remove detail without losing meaning. Right? And when we talk about scale, the impact of generalization will become far more apparent. But basically, you can imagine as you change the cartographic scale, right? As you change the relationship between the size of objects and the map and the real world, you can imagine that it would become relevant to be able to determine what the level of detail is you need. So for example, the number of vertices you need in vector data, or the spatial resolution or the cell size that you would need in raster data, from the perspective of giving enough information that it's relevant to the user, but also balancing that against having unnecessary data volume and unnecessary detail that might confuse or bog down the map unnecessarily. And striking that balance is really the heart of generalization. And generalization typically deals with taking data that is more detailed and running it through a series of processes and applications and steps to, again, remove or manipulate detail without losing critical meaning. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to talk about we're really going to talk about 10 approaches. We're going to talk about 10 approaches to generalization. We're going to talk about 4 sort of critical aspects, I guess you could say, 4 critical aspects. To be aware of with generalization. And then we're going to wrap up with the sort of best practices of generalization. Right? How do you take these approaches and these aspects and combine them into a set of best practices so that you can feel confident that when you're going through this idea of generalization, that you're making the best choices that you can. So hopefully this all makes sense. And again, if you have any questions, as always, please reach out. Thank you.